Yo, what's up? Let's go. What's up, y'all? Tonight we're covering J.D. Salinger's mid 20th century novel, The Catcher in the Rye. Sorry, it's mirrored. I can't figure it out. Yeah, tonight we're covering this seminal American classic book. And as usual, we're going to be looking at it from a sort of a different perspective. I'll just start off by saying that, Catcher in the Rye, it's an interesting book. Of course, probably everybody here has read it. If you haven't, that's cool, because we're going to go into it. I'm going to give you my sort of thesis statement in a minute, and we're going to talk about J.D. Salinger, a little bit about the life of J.D. Salinger. As usual here, we don't really go so much into the life of the author or the poet. We're going to be looking strictly at the text and the speaker, and we're going to be trying to determine some of the weird things, of course, that come out of Catcher in the Rye. But I got to say, the first time I read this book, I was in 6th grade. So I was probably, how old are you in 6th grade? 11, something like that. And 11 or 12, I don't know. But I remember I was in 6th grade. I found a copy of it, and I'd heard about it, and it just kind of appealed to me. It's a cool book because it's like a little small, little pocket-sized book. And rereading it decades and decades later, it is wild, the amount of material that, of course, just doesn't, you don't catch as a 6th grader reading it. And of course, you can read the book in a number of different sort of, you can read it from a number of different perspectives. But what we're mainly going to be talking about here is who is Holden Caulfield, the speaker, protagonist. What's his deal? We'll be talking about prep school and boarding school, the sort of, interpersonal politics of prep school and boarding school in the, especially in the mid 20th century, the legacy of the book and what it does now. We're going to be talking about Holden's worldview and, of course, our own worldview or the meaning of the book through the lens specifically of the text. And I'll also be discussing a little bit of Robbie Burns, from which the title comes. This is an old copy. This is an 1858 New York first edition of Poems and Songs by Robert Burns that my good friend Rollin gave me one year for Christmas. So shouts out to Rollin. Look at this book. Great, brilliant book. Beautiful binding. So shouts out to Rollin. Love you out there. And I'll also be discussing sort of on the periphery Rushmore, which, has there are obvious parallels between the Wes Anderson film Rushmore, and Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye. And then I'll also be discussing a little bit of The Basketball Diaries by Jim Carroll. This is a great book. This is one of my favorite books. I've read this book. I read this book in 1997, again 1998, 2000, 2002, 2007. I've reread it a number of times. And of course, if you didn't know, you may have seen the film with Leo there. Shouts out to Jethro. His favorite actor is Leo. You may have seen the film. This is Leo's big film before, of course, before Titanic. And then there is, if you haven't read the book, it's amazing. And then there's a sequel to The Basketball Diaries called Forced Entries. And I actually discussed that in the last stream, talking about modern art. And then I've got Jim Carroll's two of his books of poems here. These are a pretty rare book. It's a Penguin Poets book, but it's called Living at the Movies by Jim Carroll, the real life Jim Carroll, the poet who's dead now, and Fear of Dreaming, which I got this book in. I signed it and then I wrote every day on it because I used to read this book every day. But there are obvious parallels between that and Catcher in the Rye. So let's dive in. Shouts out to everybody who's here. We got a busy night tonight. Of course, after this stream is over, we're going to be going over to Crucible to see and to hear Andy, BPF's big announcement. Got a big announcement tonight. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe it's a big surprise. But he's got a big announcement tonight. So shouts out to Andy, big supporter of the show. Shouts out to Rachel, based homeschool mom. Shouts out to all my friends and family out there. I love y'all. And of course, JD is also streaming right now. So we're going to head over there as well, of course, at Jay's Analysis, Jay Dyer. So, yes, shouts out to everybody out there. Thank you for being out. being with me here. And I got to say, so this book, I'll just give you some or rather second impressions, because I'm first read it again when I was 11 or 12, and I reread it now as an almost 42-year-old. And it was published in serial form in 1945, then 1945, 1946, and then it was published in 1951 book form, and it remains. It's a crazy book because it's sort of standard reading in schools, but it's also on the list of sort of semi-banned books, and you can see why it is so salacious for a mid 20th century audience. But there's a lot in this book that really hit me. I mean, first of all, it's funny. It's funny as hell. There's a lot of Holden. Like, yes, we're not going to really talk too much about like teen angst and the usual perspectives on the book, because I think that's sort of number one, kind of played out, and two, it's not exactly accurate. So we're gonna see what's the reason for Holden Caulfield's acerbic wit and his sort of sardonic humor. He's a sullen boy. But what I'll say is that and of course we're going to be talking about a little bit. We're going to go into the intelligence ties. If you didn't know this, J.D. Salinger's intelligence ties. A little bit into MK Ultra and Monarch programming, and why the book is known as an MK Ultra programming book, and it is known as that. And so we'll sort of discuss what that means, and whether it's I don't know if we can actually determine whether it's accurate or not, but what we can determine about the truth of the statement. And of course, we'll be talking about a little bit about MDC and Jonathan Lennon and the event that occurred in 1980. The big Jonathan Lennon event in 1980 outside the Dakota Building in New York City, and Catcher in the Rye's ties to that. So, all right. So my thesis statement for the book essentially is that it's everything and nothing. And what I mean by that is that Holden Caulfield is the child of he's a privileged boy. He goes to boarding school in the Northeast. He's a product of this sort of old boy network, but he is subversive. But there's a reason for that, and we're going to talk about his. I don't use this word like lightly. I know it's overused. It's overused, kind of like gaslighting is overused right now in the media, of course. But that would be his trauma, because he does go through a couple of things in the book that you may not realize or you may not remember that are pretty, they're pretty hardcore, and so there's a reason for this, and it's pretty wild. But nevertheless, he has a biting sense of humor. He has strong family ties with his little sister. Not so much with his parents. In fact, he never appears in the same scene or with his parents. He never talks to his parents throughout the book, although they play a major role in his psyche, of course. And we're going to discuss some of his friends and his education, and then we'll discuss whether the book is sort of fits as an MK Ultra programming book, which I do. Just to say, I do think that is probably true and accurate. And of course, we're going to go through some of the passages in the book. By everything and nothing, what I mean is that, again, he has everything. On the surface, he seemingly has everything. He has family, he has money, he has an education, and he's got opportunities. But he also has nothing, in the sense that he does not have strong parental figures in his life. He has friends, but one of his major criticisms, and in fact, at the end of the book, what he says to his sister, the reason that he failed out of school and that he hates it, is because he doesn't see anybody having any substance. He thinks everybody is sort of fake. Now, his sister calls him out on this, and she says, essentially, what do you like? Because the book is negative, right, in the sense that it's sarcastic. I've talked before about what I think about sarcasm. I think that sarcasm, especially in literature, and this is brought out through all of the streams that we've done. We've talked about this. Um, Especially you'll notice this in Shakespeare that I think of sarcasm as the sort of the lowest form of humor in a way. I think there are appropriate times for sarcasm, especially when you're hanging with your homies, and stuff like that. But that's because you have a sincerity or you have a structure or you have a background that counteracts your sarcasm. And sarcasm in terms of literature is kind of at the low end of the totem pole because it takes very little thinking or intelligence or an intuitive mind. However, the pun is at the opposite end of the spectrum. I think that the pun and wit and wordplay are sort of almost counterintuitive in a way. They are high IQ. They take a certain level of sophistication and of understanding, reading the room. And it's interesting to note that why does Salinger make this character so sarcastic? Well, it's on purpose, it's purposeful, and it's actually one of the brilliant things about the book because, people will talk about how The Catcher in the Rye is, the sort of ultimate statement of teen angst, which is, of course, a term that didn't come about really until the latter part of the 20th century in terms of, making its way into the public sphere, into the zeitgeist, or into the common lexicon, right? Or into the lexicon. It's a redundant phrase. And I think that the book reminds me a lot of James Joyce. I actually have it right here, of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Shouts out to Crispy out there. It reminds me a lot of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man because one thing that's interesting about this work in terms of its form and content working together to produce meaning, but especially in terms of its form, is that you'll notice that if you look back into the canon of literature, oftentimes one of the tropes of youth, especially even if you look at fairy tales or child tales from the 19th century and prior to that, one thing that you have is there is no distinction between the audience and the age of the speaker. In other words, it doesn't, and this is something that Salinger and Joyce really sort of fixed in the 20th century. And what that means is essentially that if you are speaking in the voice, if your speaker in your book, let's say you're an author, and your speaker is in the voice of a 17-year-old, right, 17-year-old private school lad, then your state, not only your state of mind, but your very diction has to match that. And that's one thing that they really didn't, if you read Dickens is great, and Dickens is, part of the canon, and we can do a whole other stream on Dickens sometime. But one thing that you notice about Dickens is that oftentimes the diction is too high. It's at too high of a level to be accurate for the speaker. And one thing that Joyce does brilliantly at the start of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is he starts off the book and he is speaking in the guise of a young child. And so I've read this before, but I'll reread it again just for the sake of setting up for Catcher in the Rye here. He says, and this is almost poetic, right? He says, "Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tuku." In other words, the first paragraph of the book fits the voice of the young. It's accurate. It's as if an actual child wrote this. Now, we know that it's written in hindsight and that it's a man, it's James Joyce writing it, but the fact that there is no punctuation in the first paragraph, that he repeats phrases sort of unnecessarily for the setting, and that he says moo cow especially, right, is something that a child would say. And I read that because Salinger does the exact same thing with Catcher in the Rye. Of course, he's not too young. He's like a 16, 17-year-old private school kid. And he does have a pretty high vocabulary, but it's not unusual for the circumstances and for his education and for his educational level. In fact, he goes on a tangent towards the end of the book when he meets one of his friends who graduated, now goes to Columbia, and he constantly is making reference to the fact that this friend has the highest vocabulary of anyone he knows, especially any of his friends his age. And and that he was actually, at one point he says he was actually tested for it at school and he had the highest vocabulary. So it's also interesting to note that Holden Caulfield flunks all of his classes except for English class, of course. And he's wry in how he talks about his education, but it's authentic to sort of a latter teenager. It's like we know that he's educated and we know that he loves his reading and he talks about his reading material, but he's a little shy about ownership of that. And part of that is because of social pressure. Part of that is because of the sort of old boy network in which he lives. It's because of boarding school, because of getting sort of ribbed, about things you're interested in. Of course, you get mocked for that when you're a teenager, but he still owns it, and he lives outside of the norms of society in a number of ways. And I don't think that, part of my thesis is that, in fact, most people in their sort of reading of the book will say that he subverts the norms and that he represents this sort of, very 20th century rebellion. But in fact, I think it's almost opposite. That is almost not the case in terms of it. It's actually the opposite effect. And one thing I mean by that is you can see why these, OSS, CIA, Yale guys, and Ivy League guys loved this book, because even though Holden Caulfield criticizes specifically Yale, and he says at one point that he hates anybody that goes to the Ivy League, he is one of them. And his criticisms are sort of an inside criticism. His subversive behavior is one that they would adopt. There's a brilliant passage actually where he talks about how he couldn't leave his stuff. He couldn't leave anything anywhere when he's at boarding school because he says it's full of thieves. And you may be watching this and you might think, well, yeah. Or you might think, what? And the reason you might have an issue with that is because, or one thing you may not know, is that private schools, especially private schools and boarding schools on the East Coast, are almost all Episcopal boarding schools, and they almost all have an honor code. And the honor code is there because it will prep you for a prep school. It will prep you for college. It'll prep you for university. For instance, UVA still has a strict honor code. A number of schools still do, and they take it seriously in a number of ways, especially academically. In terms of, citing sources, plagiarism. You can be expelled from school for things like that. Not all schools have that. And we know, obviously, that not all schools now, have this sort of thing. They wouldn't even dream of such a thing. But this is sort of a holdover from classical education. And one of the things that, these types of schools are known for is, you can leave the honor code is sort of hammered into your everyday life starting at about 6th grade, when you really have a concept of what it means. And it's something that you have to write. You have to put a pledge basically on every single paper that you turn in. Every paper, every assignment, everything you do. And it is, of course, it is school and faculty enforced, but it is sort of student led. And what that means is that, for instance, if you're running to the dining hall, at lunchtime, you can throw your backpack into the middle of the grass or the lawn or the mall or whatever it is. Throw your backpack there, and you could go weeks without ever picking it up, and no one will touch it. Now, at the same time, on the other hand, these schools are known for sort of a secret thievery, and anybody can really tell you. I mean, you know this from looking at geopolitics books and the books of these people who are educated in these sort of higher elite circles and networks, that they may have all this on the surface, but at the same time, it allows for the purposeful subversion, inversion, and degeneracy that occurs in later life, right? Remember the quote about the CIA and OSS, right? Where else could a good red-blooded young man, KILL, steal all that stuff with the sanction of the U.S. government? So it's an interesting sort of double life or double, it's a sort of dichotomy. And Holden Caulfield says at one point, he says that private schools and prep schools are full of the worst thieves one can imagine. And not only that, but it's like, okay, yeah, the book is set in the 40s and 50s, and we have this teenage boy, and we know that back then everybody smoked, right? I mean, it's like that Family Guy skit. It's like you walk into the diner and it's like, hey, give me a steak sandwich. What do you want to? You want cigarettes on your steak sandwich? Yeah. What do you think? I'm a Mary? Of course I want cigarettes on my steak sandwich, right? I mean, everybody just smoked everywhere. However, they did have rules, and youth weren't supposed to smoke. But one thing Holden does, one thing he says, which I thought is funny and very true, is that like he'll light up a cigarette in his dorm room, and his roommate or his friends will come by and they'll say, you got to put that out. It's against the rules. They're going to come by. And he says, who cares? Right? Who cares what they say? Now, part of that is because he's already been expelled from school and he's on his way out. But later on, he's in a train. He's on the train car. This is an awesome scene. He's on the train car and he meets the mom of one of his friends, and he lies about his name, and he lies that he's friends with the kid. To us, the dramatic irony is, to us, he's telling us what a shit this guy is that he knows. He's a total, he's a D-bag or whatever. But to the mother, he's saying, oh, he's a wonderful fella, And then he lights up a cigarette, and then the mom of this other guy, who's this, this sexy woman, she likes him because she says, oh, you went to Pensy Prep, and she's obviously, there's something there, right? And he's smart enough to realize this. But he says essentially, he lights up a cigarette and she says, you can't smoke here. And he says, yes, I can. Would you like one? And then she takes a cigarette and she smokes a cigarette. Then he tries to get her to go to the club car to get him a scotch and soda or something. And she says, no. She draws the line at that. No, I better not do that. I have to go home. And, so it's pretty funny. The way that the one thing that I thought was the funniest was, first of all, the language is obviously a bit dated now, right? Some of the expressions, but they translate well to now, in that you just have to change the words around. Like, so for instance, one of his common expressions is, that killed me, or she killed me. And it's the same as saying like, that's dead, or I'm dead. He means it in exactly the same way. He is humored by things that they say. He laughs. And the interaction between Holden and his friends is especially true. Like, because he's a 16-year-old kid, and I just, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like that was yesterday for me. And like, there's a scene at the beginning where he's in the dorm room, and he's talking to his friend, and his friend is like a Chad. He's I forget his name, but his friend is a Chad, and he's like, he's combing his hair. He's like the best looking dude. He's a lady killer. He's about to go out on this date with the headmaster's daughter. And, he like gets good grades. He's popular. He's funny, all this stuff. And they're talking, and Holden's like kind of behind him, smoking a cigarette. And then all of a sudden he says, like, he breaks into this like tap dancing routine. I don't know if you'll think this is funny, and it's funny. I'm not going to do it justice, but he breaks into this like fake like tap dancing routine. And his friend like kind of turns around and he says, I've got a show tonight at the Ziegfeld Follies. I'm the best damn tap dancer in the world. And his friend's like, what are you talking about? And he's just being funny. He's being silly. He's being silly. He's doing this like silly dance. And then he jumps on him and he like puts him in a half Nelson, and he explains what a half Nelson is. And the guy says, cut it out, cut it out. And he's got him in a half Nelson, and he says, you can't break my unbreakable vice-like grip. And I thought that was like so true. That's so true to the way that, dudes, it's like just the dudes being dudes. They're just playing around, and whatever. I thought that was really cool. I thought that was funny. There are a number of scenes like that are really endearing. And one thing to be said about the form of the book is that it's all true. It's all true in the sense that this is a teenager writing the book, and of course this is Salinger writing the book. But the voice is so true and real, and maybe it's just me that I identified with the book or whatever, but there's a lot in it that I just found to be so true. And it's not until we get to, speaking of form, it's not until you get to passages where the single paragraphs will take up 1 or 2 pages where you're in for something different, where you're in for a glimpse into Holden's mind his true character and the reasons for his actions and his activities and his attitude. And and I think that that's pretty telling because he doesn't, even though the whole book is about him sharing his experiences, most of it is on the surface, which is ironic because his criticisms of other people are about surface level things. And the fact, the way that he goes on tangents, the way that he gives his opinion about just about everything in the world is very, it's like, it's funny and it's true, in a lot of ways. There now the subversive and the sort of darker parts of the book, we'll see that there's a reason for that. There's a reason within the text for the things that he goes through, and the symbolism is striking. So let's just start. I'm just going to start. I'm going to read a number of like specific passages, and I'm going to get into some of the MK Ultra passages. That what I see as, okay. So I'm sure everybody here knows this, but if you don't know that, then I'll just briefly explain. So the book is known as it's known as an MK Ultra programming manual. Okay, and one of the things that I think about it is I think it's such a strange book in a way. It's so bizarre in terms of its narrative and the reason for it even existing in the first place. Right? It's raison d'être. It almost seems like there is coded language within the book, especially in a couple of passages. And we're going to look at some of those passages. Now, I will say that, for instance, this book back here, Mind Wars, talks about how Catcher in the Rye and The Wizard of Oz are two of the most central MK Ultra related Monarch programming books. And I think part of that is my own opinion about that. My thesis would be that these programmers sort of needed a cipher, or they looked for a cipher. And when they were going through their Monarch programming, in other words, they were doing their Monarch programming on their victims, that they needed a cipher. And of course, they took The Wizard of Oz because of its obvious symbolism and what the book entails, and the fact that that's sort of mirrored within the book. But Catcher in the Rye is a little different, and it's because of some of the things that Holden does in the book, and because they simply related to the book in a number of ways. And I would see that as a sort of an MK Ultra, programming language cues that seem to be ready-made. Now, we're going to go into a little bit how J.D. Salinger may have done this purposefully because he was an intelligence agent, if you didn't know that. He was in counterintelligence. He was involved in sort of post World War II and paperclip activities. He landed at D-Day, if you didn't know that, and he was involved in the interrogation of NAZI prisoners of war, and may have encoded this specifically into his language. So we're going to get into that, but first, let's get into just like the start of the book and see what it says. First of all, he opens the book in the second person. He speaks directly to the reader, which is interesting. It's unique and interesting. It's like sort of, it's teen language, and it's an immediate reversal of the Dickensian Victorian narrative and social mores. Right off the bat, he says, this is the very first page of the book. He says, if you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like, and how my parents were occupied all before they had me, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. Okay, so right away, we have the total rejection of the Dickensian style of narrative, especially relating to the young man and the rite of passage and the coming of age story. He throws Dickens out the window, and I say out the window because if you know Catcher in the Rye, there are a number of different scenes involving both the shattering of windows, meaning the shattering of the psyche, symbolizing the shattering of his psyche, and also a literal defenestration, a literal jumping out a window, which is a disturbing scene, but is a key to the whole thing. We also see the word lousy, which I realized reading the book he uses only in specific moments and is a key sort of coded word phrase for his own psyche and his upbringing. Because later in the book, there's a scene where he is in the room, he sneaks back home, and he sneaks into his house. He's avoiding the floorboards. He knows what creaks. He knows what's loud, what's too loud. And he goes into his sister's room, his sister Phoebe, and he talks to her. And Phoebe is his younger sister, but is also she's like the sophomore, the wise fool, right? She's like the sort of the fool character because of her how she acts, natural to her age, but she's also wise, and she sort of keeps him in check. And at one point she says, "Oh, the mother hears Phoebe awake and comes in, and Holden hides in the closet." Interesting. He hides in the closet, and he avoids his mother. And then when he overhears the conversation to his mother talking to Phoebe, and Phoebe says something like, she's like, I don't know, how old is she? Like 8 years old or something. And she says something like, her mother says, "How was it going over to your friend's house?" And she says like, "Oh, it was lousy." And her mother says, "Now, didn't your father tell you not to use that word? It's an ugly word." And now, look, that's kind of dated, obviously. That's been fast forwarded to now. That would be like, if you're, I don't know, if a teenager said shitty or something to their parents, I don't know what it would be like. But we can see that they have a structure in their home, in their household, and in their upbringing, and she has sort of violated that. But Holden uses that specifically. That's coded into his behavior, right? And he uses it purposefully because he has a conscientious and conscious rejection of, I wouldn't say his parents' values necessarily, but he has a conscious rejection of their relationship with him because they are absent. His mother comes into the room to talk to his sister. He has snuck into the house, and his mother has no idea that he's there, is just totally clueless, and is just has no intuition, right? And then when he leaves, he kind of just barrels out of the house. He doesn't care if he's caught. And the reason for that is that, he says his father is well-to-do, and his father, interestingly enough, his dad, I thought this was pretty revelatory in the book. He talks about, there's a scene where Holden is in New York, and he says that, like, he's not too fond of Broadway shows. He likes some shows, but he's not too fond of it. He hates the kind of idea of it. And that's because his dad donates money to fund Broadway shows. He's a Broadway funder, right? He's a major financial source. And why is that revelatory? Well, because I guess it should be probably fairly obvious. His father is more interested in the fantasy life, right? In fake life on a stage than he is with his actual life. One thing interesting that sort of mirrors that, and is sort of a meta mirror, I guess, is the fact that I didn't know this, that Salinger dated Una O'Neill, the daughter of Eugene O'Neill, at one point. And Eugene O'Neill, of course, is the Nobel Prize winning playwright. I've got his book right up here. He's the Nobel Prize winning playwright, Long Day's Journey into Night. One of the great works of American literature. He wrote The Iceman Cometh and so forth. I think I've read probably every Eugene O'Neill play. But, and Eugene O'Neill, of course, was friends with the guy. You guys seen that movie Reds from like 1981, 1982 with Warren Beatty? And it actually includes a real life interview with Henry Miller, among other people. But it's about that American journalist, I forget his name, who went over to Soviet Union and joined the Communist Party and all that stuff. But when he came back, he was friends with Eugene O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill is played by Jack Nicholson in the film. Anyway, so that sort of obviously is a window into the fact that Holden hates actors. He rarely finds a movie that he likes because he says, he even goes on a tangent at one point talking about Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, how he saw Hamlet. He was out on a date, he saw Hamlet, and he discusses Romeo and Juliet with some nuns, who are some of the only characters that he likes in the book, that he respects and that he likes, and truly has a genuine appreciation for. He actually even asks about whether he could join a monastery at one point. But he, that ties into my everything and nothing thesis for the work, because again, Holden has all of the he has all of the elements for um, being a virtuous person, for being a good guy, for having faith, for believing in God. But he at one point he says that of course he's an atheist, and but 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 he doesn't really know what that means. So he's got everything and nothing. Does that make sense? He could have faith, but instead he has nothing, and he's confused in the book because he doesn't really know. The book is about him trying to figure out life and sort of what it means in the context of what has happened to him, and some pretty excuse me folks, sorry to the affiliates, some pretty messed up things happened to him um, over the concept over the course of the book. But sorry, I went on that little tangent. What was I talking about? Just babbling on here, y'all. Um, he says he says let's see. He says, in the first place, that stuff bores me. And in the second place, my parents would have about 2 hemorrhages apiece if I told anything pretty personal about them. They're quite touchy about anything like that, especially my father. They're nice and all that. I'm not saying that, but they're also touchy as hell. He's saying a lot right there. Right. He's saying basically that he has no relationship with his parent, no genuine relationship with his parents or anybody around him. And that's really what he's searching for. He's searching for something real. Remember, like Jackie Treehorn says in The Big Lebowski, right? Used to be about story, feeling. He's looking for feelings. He's looking for something real. He's looking for something that he can hold on to in his life, because everything in his life has sort of, not everything, but major things in his life have shattered his sort of preconceptions about life. He says, besides, I'm not going to tell you my whole. I'm not going to read any of the. If I ever come to a point where I'm quoting the text, I'm just going to skip over the blasphemous parts where he takes the Lord's name in vain. And I'm doing that for me. Look, if you have a problem with that, I don't care. I'm sorry, I don't care. I'm just not going to do that because and I'm not trying to be I'm not like virtuous or anything. I'm not trying to make a statement. I'm just saying I'm not going to read them. Okay. Because I think it's shit. But it does play into his everything and nothing theme in this, right? He's constantly blaspheming. He's constantly using language for the sake of, I guess, out of his anger, his angst, his anger, and the fact that he's trying to hold on. He's trying to find something, and he's trying to make his way through the sort of shit of life in order to get to something good. He says, let's see, I'll just tell you about this madman stuff that happened to me around last Christmas just before I got pretty run down, had to come out here and take it easy. I mean, that's all I told DB about. He's my brother and all. He's in Hollywood. That isn't too far from this crummy place, and he comes over and visits me practically every weekend. He's going to drive me home when I go home next month, maybe. He's got a Jaguar. It's one of those little English jobs that can do around 200 miles an hour. It cost him damn near $4,000. He's got a lot of dough now. He used to be just a regular writer when he was home. He wrote this terrific book of short stories, The Secret Goldfish, in case you never heard of him. The best one in it was The Secret Goldfish. It was about this little kid that wouldn't let anybody look at his goldfish because he bought it with his own money. It killed me. Now he's out in Hollywood, DB, being a prostitute. If there's one thing I hate, it's the movies. Don't even mention them to me. All of that in the opening paragraph of the book. We got a lot of characterization. And a couple of things here that may be obvious to you, but the symbolism of the fact that his brother writes a short story called The Goldfish indicates is a mirror of Holden's own life. He feels like he is in a goldfish bowl where he's just sort of swimming around in a circle with no escape. And he constantly talks about escape and how he wants to go somewhere else, right? He wants to get out of town. He wants to go to Colorado. He wants to go on adventures. He wants to run away. And he can't do that because of not really societal norms, essentially. He doesn't really care about those. He doesn't really give a shit about those. He cares about the fact that he doesn't know who he is, and he just wants to escape, but not for the sake of escapism. He wants to, again, latch onto something real, something good. Also, the fact that he calls his brother a prostitute, and it's interesting because obviously we would take that to be figurative, right? He's saying, oh, his brother whored himself out by going to Hollywood, being a screenwriter. But I would actually say that maybe this is literal, because there is obviously a lot about sexuality in the book. I mean, he's of the age he is, and he gives long passages about that. That's one of the major driving forces in the book. Also, the fact that what's interesting is you notice that right away he's writing the book in hindsight, and that where is he? Well, he never states it specifically so, but Holden is in a mental institute, right? He has to be. He talks about some of his actions completely violate the standards of social and familial and academic norms, and they don't know what to do with him. This would probably still be the case, especially with a privileged young man. And at the end of the book, he keeps getting kicked out of these elite boarding schools. And at the end of the book, he says something like, "That's when I, this happened before I got sick, and now I'm writing this here," which is to say, we know he's in a mental institute or some sort of facility, and he's writing his book. Now, that will play into the sort of the Monarch and the MK Ultra tangents that occur within the book. And one of the reasons that just on a normie surface level, people see Mark David Chapman and others as having sort of an identification with this character. My idea of that would be that this was not an identification that they came up with on their own. This was something programmed into them. He says, let's see. Also, okay, he says in the second paragraph, where I want to start telling is the day I left Pensy Prep. And it's obviously a fictional boarding school, but at one point he mentions Andover, which is like Andover Academy, and then you get I see this kind of a Phillips Exeter, which is a North Massachusetts boarding school where the elites go, where W and others went. But otherwise, Wooten School and some of the other schools are, simply pseudonyms for elite boarding schools in Pennsylvania and New York. He says, Pensy Prep is this school. It's in Hagerstown, Pennsylvania. You probably heard of it. You've probably seen the ads anyway. They advertise in about 1,000 magazines, always showing some hotshot guy on a horse jumping over a fence. Like as if all you ever did at Pensy was play polo all the time. I never even once saw a horse anywhere near the place. And underneath the guy on the horse's picture, it always says, since 1888, we've been molding boys into splendid, clear-thinking young men. Strictly for the birds. They don't do any damn more molding at Pensy than they do at any other school. And I don't know anybody there that was splendid and clear thinking at all. Maybe 2 guys, if that many. And they probably come to Pensy that way. Pretty intuitive, right? For this kid. Also, notice the 1888. I mean, maybe it's accidental, but whenever I hear 1888, I think Jack the Ripper. He says, let's see. He talks about he was on the fencing team. That's why I put up the picture. I mean, look, Rushmore Max Fisher is obviously a Holden Caulfield character. One of the little interesting things in the film, Rushmore, by the way, is the fact that Holden Caulfield wears this unique hunting cap. It's like a red cap, with the bill and the 2 flaps that go down. And he turns it around backwards, which is kind of a precursor to later hip culture, but it's sort of a totem. It's totemistic to him, right? Because he's hunting. He's out there hunting for women. He's hunting for his lifestyle. He's hunting for life, and he's sort of burning with this desire to find something truthful. But also the fact that in Rushmore, you notice that Max Fisher's dad wears the same cap. If you didn't notice that. And at one point, Max Fisher even wears a red cap himself. He wears that red beret, right? When he's remember he forms the go-kart club, and the French club, and he wears this red beret, right? And now the difference is that Max Fisher comes from he's there on scholarship because he's a writer, and he comes from his father is a hair cutter, and then he's a barber. And he claims that he's a brain surgeon, which is an interesting poetic way of looking at that, right? Of lying. And Max Fisher's whole life is about lying and telling stories, and that's why he's a playwright. And yet, Holden Caulfield also does the same thing. He says that he lies about everything. He lies, and it's just for fun, and he can lie all day long. In fact, when he meets the hot lady on the train, she says, like, "What's your name?" And he says, like, "Oh, my name's Rudolph Steiner," or something like that. And he says that's the name of the he says that was the name of the janitor at the school. But he just lies. Like, at one point he asks a guy, and he goes to a club, like a jazz club, and he asks the guy in the bathroom, like, "You guys need a manager?" And it's very Max Fisher. And obviously Max Fisher in Rushmore is dealing with the death of his mother. That's his hole in his psyche and his heart, and he's sort of trying to fill that through his activities in the film. But in the book, I might as well just say this now because I've been alluding to it the whole time. So you may not know what happens to Holden and why he is the way that he is. Well, what happens to him, there are a couple of things. One is that he talks about his cousin, and that his cousin got leukemia and died. And he was extremely close with his cousin. He was there one minute, and he's gone the next. And this plays. This is why I related it to the Basketball Diaries, because that is the same reason for Jim Carroll's problems, his issues, the thing that makes this big hole in his heart in the book, that he's got this best friend who is the best athlete, the best basketball player. He's the best friend. He's the most popular. And all of a sudden he catches leukemia in New York, and he's dead. And he goes to see him in his casket, and he can't believe that his healthy, angelic friend is now this, cold corpse of a man, right? And the interesting thing is that nobody understands what he's gone. He least of all understands what happened. But he says at one point, let me see if I can find the passage. He says at one point that he goes and he breaks out all the windows of this farm, of this like, is it a farmhouse? And let me see if I can find it. I don't know if I can find. That might not have been one of the things that I put in here. Let's see. Let's find the windows, because it would be better if I just quoted the text. If I can't find it quickly, then I'll just tell you off the top of my head. But yeah, so what he does is, like, he's angry. He's upset, and he doesn't understand why his friend is gone. And so he goes into this, like, house. I think it's like an old farmhouse that's been converted. He goes in and he smashes out all the windows. And of course, and he breaks his hand. He breaks his hand, and he's, like, sent to the hospital. And his parents, of course, that's the start of them thinking that he's mentally ill. And what they don't understand is that he can't understand, this is his rite of passage, right? Remember that the rite of passage in literature is always about, we hear the term rite of passage, and we think of it as, like, the youth turning into adulthood. But I'm sure this is a hot take, everyone knows this, but my personal opinion about this, through literary analysis and through life, is that the rite of passage, right, the ritual, which comes obviously from the Greeks, and everybody's seen 400, right, when they take the boy and they take him out into the wilderness, and they say, you don't come back, and it's supposed to set up for when they're in the military, right? And you either come back with your shield or on it. And it's like, go out there and fight the mythical beast, and then don't come back until you've slayed it and showed that you're a man. But what that really means, and especially translated into the modern era, is the loss of innocence. And the loss of innocence means when a person transitions from being a child to being an adult, in the sense of understanding and realizing death. And that may sound obvious, but what I mean by that is, think about your own life and think about when you're a child. If you're 5 years old and your great-grandmother dies, and all the family's around. You're outside and you're playing on your big wheel and you're making noise and it's just another day for you. You understand that something has happened and you understand she's gone, but it doesn't mean anything to you on a visceral level. You can't really understand it. It's not until you are a little older, let's say, 12 years old, when you are first confronted with death and you lose a loved one, for instance, or a friend, and you understand, truly, you understand in your mind, body, and soul that they were there 1 minute and the next minute they're gone. And that is a thing that, in a way, it's interesting how life works, because in a way it breaks you, and in another sense it makes you. It makes you into a man. It makes you into a woman. It makes you into an adult, because you understand that life is temporary, life is short, right? And that you're not going to live forever as this child in an idyllic, pastoral, ever never-ending childhood. And Holden goes through that as a teenager when he loses his cousin slash friend. But the painful part of that, the really painful part of it, is that nobody around him is sensitive to that or understands. And this is one of the problems that I often find with other adults is that like I said at the beginning of the stream, personally speaking, like I feel like I was, like when I read this and he's 16, I feel like I was 16 like 5 minutes ago. I remember it vividly. I remember everything about it. I remember every day. I remember every image. I remember every sound. I remember everything I ever did. And it feels like it was yesterday. And I think that there's this somewhere along the line for most, grown-ups. I don't know about most grown-ups, but a lot of grown-ups, they forget that they were that age once. And they sort of lose a lot of the things that made them who they are in the first place. That you have to remember these things. You have to remember like what your mind was like. Just because your mind is growing doesn't mean you can't remember what your mind was like at a certain age. Does that make sense? And I think that's important for literature because the adults in Holden's life, they're like, it's incomprehensible to them that he would do this, that he would go and break out all the windows. He's obviously breaking out all the windows because the windows represent his mind. His mind was a perfect structure. It was this house, and everything was safe in it. And you could look into the wind. You could look out the window and you could see life beyond, but you could also see your own reflection in the mirror. But all of a sudden, that's shattered by the death of his cousin, and so his mind is shattered. So he breaks out the windows, and he literally draws blood, right? And that is a representation of the pain that he feels, the exterior pain. Now he feels it in the interior sense. And the other thing that happens is, speaking of windows, is in the book, the reason for Holden's, you don't learn this until the end of the book, because he's fucked up. I mean, he is. He's got money, but he keeps getting expelled from private schools. He gets in a fight with one of his friends, like he punches him, and then he gets like knocked out, but he doesn't care because he kind of wants pain. He wants to feel something. And then he gets punched again. He gets beat up in the book. He gets beat up by a pimp because he hires a prostitute. The prostitute comes, nothing happens. He pays her. The pimp comes, says, "You owe more money." He stands up for himself. He says, "No, I don't owe any more money." And then they take his money, and then he like insults the pimp. And he says, "Look, man, in 5 years, I'll be, doing whatever." This is sort of his private school mentality. In 5 years, I'll be an investment banker and you'll be cleaning my pool. But what he says is like, and you'll still be a pimp. You'll still be a piece of shit, right? And now that's interesting to look at that, because he's involved in the situation. He is part of this sort of, immorality of the situation that's occurring. But after that happens, and after the pimp, punches him in the stomach, he breaks down crying. And that leads to one of the Monarch passages, because he has a fantasy about going downstairs. He said, I'll read this to you. He says, this is page 103 of the book. He says, "All of a sudden I started to cry. I'd give anything if I hadn't, but I did. No, you're crooks. You're no crooks, I said. You're just stealing 5. Shut up, old Maurice said, and he gave me a shove. Leave him alone. Hey, Sonny said. Come on, hey, we got the dough that he owes us. Let's go. I'm coming, said old Maurice said, but he didn't. I mean it, Maurice. Hey, leave him alone. He says, who's hurting anybody? He said, innocent as hell. Then what he did, he snapped his finger very hard on my pajamas. I won't tell you where he snapped it, but it hurt like hell. It's gross. I told him he was a damn dirty moron. What's that, he said. He put his hand behind his ear like a deaf guy. What's that? What am I? I was still sort of crying. I was so damn mad and nervous and all. You're a dirty moron, I said. You're a stupid, chiseling moron. In about 2 years, chiseling means he stole from him. And in about 2 years, you'll be one of those scraggy guys that come up to you on the street and ask for a dime for coffee. You'll have snot all over your dirty, filthy overcoat, and you'll be. Then he smacked me. I didn't even try to get out of the way or duck or anything. All I felt was this terrific punch in my stomach. I wasn't knocked out or anything, though, because I remember looking up from the floor and seeing them both go out the door and shut it. Then I stayed on the floor a fairly long time, sort of the way I did with Stratler. Only this time I thought I was dying. I really did. I thought I was drowning or something. The trouble was I could hardly breathe. When I did finally get up, I had to walk to the bathroom and doubled up and holding onto my stomach and all. But I'm crazy. I swear to God I am. About halfway to the bathroom, I sort of started pretending I had a bullet in my guts. Here we go. Old Maurice had plugged me. Now I was on the way to the bathroom to get a good shot of bourbon or something to steady my nerves and help me really go into action. I pictured myself coming out of the damn bathroom, dressed and all, with my automatic in my pocket and staggering around a little bit. Then I'd walk downstairs. Instead of using the elevator, I'd hold onto the banister and all, with this blood trickling out of the side of my mouth a little at a time. What I'd do, I'd walk down a few floors, holding onto my guts, blood leaking all over the place, and then I'd ring the elevator door bell. As soon as old Maurice opened the doors, he'd see me with the automatic in my hand, and he'd start screaming at me in this very high-pitched, yellow-belly voice to leave me alone. But I'd plug him anyway. 6 shots right through his fat, hairy belly. Then I'd throw my automatic down the elevator shaft. After I'd wipe off all the fingerprints and all. Then I'd crawl back to my room and call up Jane and have her come over and bandage up my guts. I pictured her holding a cigarette for me to smoke while I was bleeding and all. The damn movies, they can ruin you. I'm not kidding. I stayed in the bathroom for about an hour, taking a bath and all. Then I got back into bed. It took me quite a while to get to sleep. I wasn't even tired, but finally I did. When I really felt like, though, was committing suicide. I felt like jumping out the window. I probably would have done it too if I'd been sure somebody'd cover me up as soon as I landed. I didn't want a bunch of stupid rubbernecks looking at me when I was all gory. Pretty wild, right? Pretty wild sort of incel fantasy here that he has. Yes? And this is crazy because this is one of the passages that MDC apparently identified with and read before he did the exact same thing at the Dakota building to Jonathan Lennon, right? In the big December night, was it December 19th? I think it was December, it was like right near the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. I can't remember if it was the same day, but it's 1980, right? And he assassinated John Lennon. Now, I would say, again, that this passage, it reeks of, it's bizarre to me. And I don't mean weird in the sense that, one of the things that I got from the book was that I remembered a Norm Macdonald joke or comment that he said, and this is so true. He said, girls are always calling me weird. They're always calling you weird when you're funny, when you're a comedian. He said, when you're younger, like girls never said you're funny. They always said you're weird. What does that even, why do they do that? Dudes think, oh man, that dude's funny. But the girls, they never get it. They always say you're weird. And what I mean by this passage is like, the passage is, it's not quite weird, but it is bizarre in the sense that it does sort of reek of a kind of a programming language because, and maybe that's just because this did occur, this exact thing occurred, right? And the fact that he says jump out the window is interesting because we learn later on that what happened later was, or earlier in the story, but later, was that, yeah, Killer Mike says, reminds me of Taxi Driver. Yeah, it is. It's the same. In fact, I wrote a note here about Taxi Driver because people may not know this, but Catcher in the Rye was not only associated with the Jonathan Lennon event. It was associated with John Hinckley Jr. It was associated with Sirhan. There are a bunch of times when Catcher in the Rye was either on the person of the Monarch guy or was in his records or was in his home. And it's very odd, right? And of course, it's like it does mirror the exact, or rather, Taxi Driver mirrors this because that's exactly what happens to Travis Bickle, right? He argues with the no, I don't know no Iris. No, I don't know no Iris, right? Oh, I'm hip. Remember he says, and then he goes in and he someday a real rain's going to come and wash the scum off the streets, right? He says. But what happens earlier in the text that we learn about later, earlier in the story, in the narrative, but later in the text, is that wasn't even the extent of his, I don't know what else we could call it except for a traumatic split in his life. There are three. There's one where his cousin dies and his family has just no idea what to do with him and they can't understand why he's going through this pain. They don't try to help him at all. And they never talk to him. They never appear in his life. The other is the pimp event, the pimp horror event. There are 4 events. The other one is that he talks about when he was at private school. He says to Phoebe at the end of the book, because she really pushes him. She says, "Why do you hate school? Why do you keep failing out of school?" And he says, "Because everyone's fake." He says there are these secret societies at school, and everybody's fake, and they never like. All they do is like sort of judge people, but they act like they're not judging. Now, part of that is just the basic, sort of dog eat dog private school world. But the thing that is very truthful about it and that is really biting is that he says he talks about his friend Ackley, I think. I knew somebody named Ackley, so I think it's Ackley. Ackley, who is this like pimple-faced guy who's like really awkward and stuff, but he's funny and he annoys Holden, but he's his friend. And he says like that guy is just an outsider at school. They don't respect him, they don't like him, he doesn't fit in. And they're really harsh to the people that don't fit in. And in fact, there was one kid that like he said he was funny and he was cool, but they always gave him hell or whatever, and not in a bullying sense. The kid did not fit into their social strata or whatever, and that's what he really hates about it. But the kid asked him, "Hey, can I borrow your turtleneck?" And Holden literally gives him the shirt off his back. He gives him the shirt off his back, and then the kid puts on the turtleneck, and then he's in the classroom, and one of the kids like says some shit, talks shit to him, and he says that the kid told him that he was a shit and he sucked and fuck you basically, and then the teachers like tried to make him apologize, and he would not apologize. He said he was speaking the truth, he would not apologize. And then they said, you're coming with us or whatever, and instead the kid turns around and jumps out the window, and they look down and he's dead. He's dead on the sidewalk down on the ground. And then there's a teacher that comes by, and he's one of the only teacher that he respects, and he says the teacher came along, checked his pulse, took off his own jacket, covered him up, and then carried his body all the way to the infirmary without saying a thing, right? And it's this, think of that. It's this, and I think the turtleneck is red too. So it's like this blood red jumping out the window, right? He'd already broken the windows. He'd already smashed the windows, and now he fantasizes about jumping out the window because he literally saw his friend do that. His friend literally killed himself right in front of him. And that, of course, fucks him up, and he essentially gets kicked out of school. The only class that he passes is English. He fails all of his other classes. He doesn't give a fuck about them. And yet he can write and he can speak intelligently and intellectually about. He talks about Beowulf, he talks about Romeo and Juliet, he talks about Hamlet, and his criticisms of the plays is, his criticism, especially of Romeo and Juliet, is pretty accurate. I mean, we cover Romeo and Juliet here, but he says it's pretty original. He says he never identified with Romeo, he never gave a shit about him, and he never liked him, especially after the death of Mercutio. He says the only person's death in the play that he cared about was Mercutio. Why? Because Mercutio was real. Right? And what do I mean by real? Well, Mercutio stood up for his friend. He had intuition about life. He had a worldview, and he was willing to fight and defend his friend. And he died. He gave his life because of it, right? And he gets stabbed in the gut. And that to Holden is like a punch in the gut, and it's also like the punch in the gut that he receives from the pimp. Do you get it? Do you see how well crafted the book is? The other thing that occurs, and this is super dark. I didn't know about this because I read it in 6th grade, and then I reread it, and now I haven't read it since then, and I reread it, and I understand, is that at one point he goes to this guy's house, and his criticism is of the secret. I think he calls it flits, and that's his like code word for when someone is, let's say, fake and gray. And he goes to this man's house, and he takes a, he goes. He has nowhere else to go. He goes to the guy's house. This is a old man, and you know what's going to happen. He takes a drink. He starts to feel woozy, and part of that is that, he hadn't slept in forever. He's been all over New York. He's been through his adventures. He's been drunk, but it's obviously because, something is in there. And when he wakes up, he has to put his pants back on, and he says the man is like patting his head. It's fucking creeper. And to Holden's, what Holden does is he immediately realizes something wrong. He gets up, he says, "What the fuck are you doing?" Right? And the guy tries to gaslight him. He says like, "Oh, you're weird." He says that thing about being weird. "You're weird. You're acting strange." And he's like, "No, man, get the fuck out of here." And the same thing happens in Basketball Diaries. And he gets his clothes on and he leaves. So we don't know what exactly happened. He kind of goes into it, but after that is the moment when his mind is shattered and fractured. You can read into what happened, and then he ends up in the mental institute, right? So this poor kid, right, has gone through all this shit. This isn't the story of the average, teen angst and disillusionment with society. No, this kid has been fucked with, and there's been a lot of shit that's happened to him, and no one, it seems, Phoebe's in his corner, but she's of course his younger sister. And another interesting thing is that at one point he tries to find Phoebe at her school in New York, because he navigates through New York City just like Jim Carroll in Basketball Diaries, but he's navigating through New York, and he ends up at her school, and her school is probably like Lycée Française or something like that, one of the elite boarding schools in New York, or the one that Jeff Stein-Effrey got a job at under Barr's dad. Remember, he had like no degree and he got a job at that school. Anyway, he finds Phoebe at the school, and as he's walking, he writes a note to her to basically say, "Here's your money," because his sister gave him all of her money, her Christmas money, which is like $8. And he takes it because he has nothing. And then he goes back and he's going to give it back to her, and he writes a message. He says it's probably going to be the last time that he sees her, because he intends on running away or something else. But as he's walking up the steps of the school, he sees that somebody has written the words "fuck you" like in the banister. And he gets so offended by this. And the reason he gets offended by it is because his sister is the only pure thing and pure person in his life. The only person untainted by the bullshit and death and all the stuff that he's been through, and who is there for him, like consistently, always there for him. She's like an angel. And he doesn't want her to have to see this nonsense on the wall. So he says, "Look, so he's going to scratch it out. But he says, what if I get caught? Of course, the teachers are going to think that I did it, right? I'm some hoodlum who snuck in and graffitied the wall." But he says, "Fuck it, I don't give a shit." So he scratches it out, right? And then he sees it again, but it's been on another banister, but it's been carved in. And this is like, the symbolism here is that it's been carved into the banister, because it's like he's going up and down the steps of life, right, in his rite of passage, and is being carved into his vision, "fuck you," like he thinks the world is against him. And obviously the world is not against him. These are the events that occur in life. He needs to not be a cringe atheist. He needs to, it's like, okay, look, like there's one part about where he talks about, they have chapel every morning, because you do that at private school and boarding school. You have chapel every morning. And he says he cringes at the minister who's like, it's a minister or the rector who's trying to be like, or the school chaplain who's like trying to be on the level with the boys. And he talks about how he says Jesus is like their friend. He's like it's kind of like the the hippie. He's trying to, it's like a pre-hippie Jesus, right? And he says, man, it's fucking bullshit. Like and I think a lot of normie narratives, in their criticism of the book, they say this blasphemous, but I would say that no, his problem is that he's looking for something pure. He's looking for faith, and he's looking for God in a way that is above the things that are in his life and the problems that are in his life. He wants objective truth. He wants God's objective truth. He wants forgiveness, and he wants his pain to be wiped away. He wants the tears to be wiped away out of his eyes. He doesn't want pickup truck, hippie Jesus. He wants the actual Christ. And so, I may be reading too much into the narrative in terms of his motivations, because he doesn't say any of that, but he doesn't say those words specifically, but that's what I would read into his character, because that's what the whole driving force of the narrative is, right? Otherwise, why does he go on this adventure? Why does he go on this sort of labyrinthine maze of trying to figure out who he is? Like, because the narrative on the surface only stands for what's happening in his spiritual life and in his mind, right? It's his sort of, mid-20th century teen version of a Dante's Inferno, but on one level. And one of the interesting things about the book is that that Holden, in a sense, does not. This is what I read. One criticism, I think, that said this is one thing that separates it from like the YBA novels, right? Which is, YA novels. YBA's Young British Artists. That's what's that guy's name? Tim Noble and Sue Webster. They're YBAs, like with Damien Hirst, and it's School of Art. Anyway, the YA literature, which is that like the character goes through a sort of a hero's journey in a way, or at least like changes at the end, but in a sort of a cursory way. But Holden never changes, and that sort of stands for, in the one sense, it stands for the kind of malaise and malignity of the mid 20th century, especially pre and post A-bomb, 20th century, right? But in another sense, it's like he hasn't changed because he hasn't had time to change. He's had time for self-reflection, but he hasn't had any time for self-reflection for something bigger, right? And I'm not saying that J.D. Salinger is meant this. I'm not saying that he's virtuous. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that's what I read into the character here. Now, it's interesting that is completely different from the Salinger program. And perhaps we should now sort of transition into some of the things about Salinger. I mean, so I linked 2 articles in the video description. By the way, if you want to support me, please look in the chat. Look at my links in the chat. Please look at the video description or the channel description, and you can support me on any of 3 platforms. Help me get up to 1,000 subs. We're trying to get some actual super chats in here coming up soon. Thank you to everybody who's always supported me. Please think about supporting me. I could use, obviously, I can always use your support and your donations, your generous donations. And I'll read some of the donations in a minute. And especially, I'll give a big shout out to the person who has sponsored this stream, who needs a big shout out. Salinger, but I've linked 2 articles in the video description. And one is from like Vice, one's from AP News, just normie level, sort of backing for this to show that this is like out in the open. This is, Salinger was I think he was at Utah Beach, D-Day, 1941. He was in the U.S. military. He was involved again in paperclip activities and in the interrogation of NAZI soldiers and officers. He was also an actual full-fledged member of CIC, counterintelligence in OSS and CIA. In fact, the AP article talks about how they had a reunion, and the two notable sort of guys that did not show up at the meeting were Henry Kissinger and J.D. Salinger. J.D. Salinger, but it also talks about Klaus Barbie and how their group was responsible for the it it came out that Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, was fostered and supported in his CIA activities in Bolivia and in South America. Klaus Barbie, if you don't know, was, again, he was an two-letter, I don't want to say which letters, Nazi interrogator, the Butcher of Lyon. And he is part of the Odessa operation, Odessa program. He got a visa at the end of the war from through the Vatican, made his way in the rat line to South America, where he then set up shop as a shipping magnate, and he was contracted by the CIA because a really interesting story. The CIA at the time, of course, was looking for people who would know the most about the Soviets and communism, and would be able to do horrible so-called interrogations, meaning Torture, and so they contracted Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie was later caught by some of the Nazi hunters, who knows how much of that is co-opted, and he was shipped back to France where he was hanged. But he was co-opted and sponsored by Salinger's own group. Now, Salinger, of course, being part of Angleton's counterintelligence corps and CIA, early CIA, and OSS before it, had a lot to do, especially through paperclip. I mean, look, read Annie Jacobson's book, and with later what we now know is, MK Ultra and Monarch programming. So it's interesting to note that passages in the book are specifically read by some of these Monarch guys. The book keeps appearing, and that there appears to be coded language. And again, I've already gone through that in the stream and what I think that is. What else? I linked the Robbie Burns poem, which is, I'll read you, let's see, the Robbie Burns poem, and what he says, which is, let's see, Coming Through the Rye, because there's a passage in the book where Phoebe points out that the catcher in the rye is not the accurate phrase in the poem from which Holden takes his cue. And the actual phrase in the poem is, let's see, is coming through the rye. He says, "Get a body, meet a body, coming through the rye. Get a body, kiss a body, need a body, cry. Oh, Jenny's sweet, etc. Coming through the rye, need a body, cry." So actually, he's misremembering purposefully, not purposefully on his part, but Salinger is misremembering this because this is sort of the faulty nature of youth and the broken window of the shattered window of the psychic mind. And the reason it's the catcher in the rye is because he talks about how his cousin who died, one thing he had was his own sort of totem is he had a catcher's mitt. And on the mitt, he wrote poems. And of course, he never says Robbie Burns, but we can later infer that one of them was the catcher in the rye, coming through the rye. And he writes poems on the fingers of his baseball glove and in the mitt. And so that represents, right, the sort of sporting youth, the innocence of the boys of summer, right, the innocence of his life and writing these poems, just like in Jim Carroll's Basketball Diaries, how his friend also did the same, but with basketball. And he was like, he read Jim's poems and his poetry. And he misremembers this as the catcher in the rye, because this is sort of one of the only things he can hold on to. Another level is that he can hold on to because he puts his hand in the glove and he's holding it. Do you understand? One thing that just as a sort of a side note, because we were talking about Jonathan Lennon, is that I just thought of the song Mind Games, because it plays into this because it's in the same era as the assassination that occurred. And we just did a music lyrics analysis stream on the Smiths. But this one is the John Lennon song Mind Games. And I just thought I would read some of the lyrics to this because they're interesting in light of of Catcher in the Rye and his own assassination. He says, we're playing those mind games together, pushing the barrier, planting seed, playing the mind gorilla, right? Guerilla, a mind gorilla, kind of like a righteous mind fight, mind warrior. Chanting the mantra, peace on earth. We all been playing those mind games forever. Some kind of druid dude lifting the veil, doing the mind gorilla. Some call it magic, the search for the grail. Now, of course, I've talked about the grail in some of my own streams, and especially in the Outremer stream. But the grail, my interpretation, what I believe the grail is in grail lore in Chrétien de Troyes and in Mallory, the grail is the Holy Eucharist. And that is it's almost an anti-Jungian, even though it's 1,000 years before Jung, it's almost an anti-Jungian archetypal search, because it's the search for purity in life by achieving the Eucharist, if that makes sense. But John Lennon does not say that. He says some call it magic, the search for the Grail. So keep on playing those mind games together. His Grail is more of a Freudian psychoanalytical Grail, which is this sort of, we're all one, sort of peace on earth, but we're all one, sort of anti-Grail. So keep on playing the mind games together. Faith in the future, out of the now. You just can't beat on those mind gorillas. Absolute elsewhere in the stones of your mind. Absolute elsewhere. Now that's sort of Salinger-esque, because everything is elsewhere. Saint elsewhere. Everything's elsewhere in the stones of your mind. Yes, we've been playing those mind games forever, projecting our images in space and time. Doing the ritual, dance in the sun, millions of mind gorillas putting their soul power to the karmic wheel, raising the spirit of peace and love, is John Lennon's own weird sort of, again, very Monarch, MK Ultra-esque lyrics, which almost seems programmed in light, and I'm not saying it is, I don't know if it is, but it certainly has all of the hallmarks of that symbolism, and plays into this Catcher in the Rye symbolism. Let's see. Glass symbolism. I said about that. Patterns of your mind. Yes, he says. So when he meets his friend, speaking of mind gorillas and patterns of your mind, he meets his friend in New York, on pages 148 and 149, and his friend is a psychoanalyst. And he says, "Has he ever psychoanalyzed you?" And the son says, "No, absolutely not. Of course he hasn't." He says, "He's helped me to adjust myself to a certain extent, but an extensive analysis hasn't been necessary. Why do you ask?" And then he said on page 148, "He wouldn't do a damn thing to you. He'd simply talk to you, and you talk to him, for God's sake. For one thing, he'd help you to recognize the patterns of your mind." Right? Patterning, depatterning, and deprogramming. Also, he talks about on pages 140 and 141 how his brother DB, who is now a so-called Hollywood prostitute or Hollywood screenwriter, maybe literally a prostitute, a rent boy, who knows, but that he himself was in D-Day. This is obviously Salinger's reflection. He says, "My brother DB was in the Army for 4 damn years. He was in the war too. He landed on D-Day and all, but I really think he hated the Army worse than the war. I was practically a child at the time, but I remember when he used to come home on furlough and all he did was lie on his bed practically. He hardly ever even came in the living room. Later, when he went overseas and was in the war and all, he didn't get wounded or anything, and he didn't have to shoot anybody. All he had to do was drive some cowboy general around all day in a command car. He once told Allie and I that if he'd had to shoot anybody, he wouldn't have known which direction to shoot in." Interesting. He said the Army was practically as full of bastards as the NAZIS were. He made Allie go get his baseball mitt, and then he asked him who was the best war poet, Rupert Brooke or Emily Dickinson. Sort of a literary joke. Allie said Emily Dickinson. I don't know too much about it myself because I don't read much poetry, but I do know it'd drive me crazy if I had to be in the Army and be with a bunch of guys like Ackley and Stratler and old Maurice all the time, marching with him and all. He says, then he goes on to talk about how his brother made him read Farewell to Arms, but he always liked The Great Gatsby. We've done a Jeff Stein-Effrey stream on the Great Gatsby. He says, "Great Gatsby, old sport. That killed me. Anyway, I'm sort of glad they've got the atomic bomb invented. If there's ever another war, I'm going to sit right the hell on top of it. I'll volunteer for it. I swear I will. In other words, he wants annihilation, right? But I think that he wants annihilation of the negativity of his life. Former Ghost says, Hendo, have a smoke. All right, I'm going to have a smoke. Just for you, former Ghost. Love you out there. I'm going to have a smoke just for you. But this is interesting because you know that Terry Southern and Stanley Kubrick took a cue from this, and that's why they made Major Kong ride the atomic bomb at the end of Doctor Strangelove. You just know that's the case, right? Let's see. Also, the baseball mitt represented his cousin in poetry in The Catcher in the Rye. He talks about whom to shoot, right? We have the war passing in D-Day. Let's see. Oh, there's a good passage where he talks about how he hates cars because how he sees like men, grown men, is that all they do is talk about how many miles to the gallon their car gets, and he just says everything's boring, right? And he says at one point he says they don't interest me. I'd rather have a horse. A horse is at least human, for God's sake. A horse you can at least, a horse is at least human. Now that's a really, again, going back to the voice of Holden Caulfield, that's a really teenage thing to say. But do you get why it's truthful? It's truthful because it's not mechanized. It's not mechanized and cold and steely. Which are representations of everyone in his life. No one seems to care or have any feelings. No one cares about him. Now he doesn't actually say nobody cares about him. In fact, he says the opposite. But his sarcasm sort of undercuts that. And when he says a horse is at least human, he means that a horse is at least organic. A horse is at least a God-created creature, right? He wants something real with blood. He wants something visceral. He wants to live. And also, he wants to ride away. He wants to ride into the sunset, in a sense. So let me give a big shouts out to Countess Powers out there. Thank you to Countess Powers. If you guys didn't know that Countess Powers is the one who sponsored the stream. She has been a big supporter of me and my channel and the streams, and she dropped some fat Kong bucks to sponsor the stream, and this was a great idea. So thank you out there, Countess, because you are the one who gave me the idea to do Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger, and I think that's a wonderful idea, and I'm glad we got into it. So shouts out to you, Countess Powers. Also, shouts out to some of my other homies out there who have supported me, especially recently. Let's see. Shouts out to Kristen. Kristen at Slow Boy Whiteboard. Always big supporter. My homegirl, Kristen. Thank you so much, Slow Boy Whiteboard, for dropping that $5. Really appreciate you. Shouts out to Maddie, Real Cooter Brown. Everybody go, please, if you're watching this, go and subscribe to Digital Minefield. Real Cooter Brown, Maddie, Digital Minefield on YouTube. He's got a new channel. He just did his first stream the other night. It was amazing. He did an analysis stream, so shouts out to Maddie. Really appreciate you. He drops $8, and he says he dropped a question via IG. I will go back to that in a second. Again, shouts out to Countess. Let's see. Shouts out to, I've had some other supporters over the past few days, so I want to make sure that I get them. Give me just a second here. Let's see. Yes, shouts out to Matt. Shouts out to Thomas Totten, who dropped me $5 the other day for the Morrissey stream, for the Smith stream. Thank you, Thomas. Really appreciate you. Shouts out to Kristen again. She supported me. Shouts out to, shouts out again to Brandon, who supported me the other day in the last stream for $25. Really appreciate you, homie. Thank you so much. Let's see, I got one earlier tonight, and that was from Andrew Martin. Shouts out to Andrew Martin for that $25. Really appreciate you, Andrew. Thank you so much for supporting me. Thank you for that sweet donation. Let's see. Shouts out to Mixkey, Mikhail, the King of Kings at Mikhail, the King of Kings. Hail the King of Kings, right? Hail the King of Kings, God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Trinity. Thank you to Mikhail, Tech Noir Graphics, our homeboy, resident artist at Tech Noir, technoir.graphics, Graffix. Is it Graffix? Mikhail at Tech, yes. No, Tech Noir, Graphix. I'm sorry, I can't spell good. Who donates $5.55 for all them 55-year-olds. Yeah, shouts out to our homeboy out there. I love you so much. Mixie, thank you. You always support me, and you are a great friend and a homeboy. Thank you so much. Let's go to Maddie's question on IG, on Insta. He says, this is from Maddie, Real Cooter Brown, Digital Minefield, who's also, by the way, J Dyer Out of Context on Instagram. He is J Dyer Out of Context. That's his Instagram account. And he says, what do you make of that period of Salinger's life where he was hanging out with a bunch of teenagers, a grown man? I did some reading about his life a while back, and I was never really sure if it was innocent mentorship or if something creepy was going on. Geez, I did not know about that. Wow, you hit me with that one. I did not know about that, but you know, we like to think the best, but judging by the circumstances and the Monarch stuff and the CIC stuff, probably a creeper. So that sucks, obviously. And I did not know about that. Wow, you hit me with that one. I did not get that one. But then again, I didn't really go deep into Salinger research in this. I just went into Catcher in the Rye because here I like to go into the text and what the text says and textual material and as a basis for understanding the meaning of the text of the book and of what, and of course its sort of repercussions and the way it echoes into history and in the literary canon. So I just really mainly went into the book. I did sort of cursory reading about Salinger. And now that you say that, I'm definitely not interested in reading into the life of Salinger. I've never really liked J.D. Salinger. I've always, it sounds weird, but I've always like kind of thought he was anathema in a way. That's the word I always think of when I think of J.D. Salinger. And now that's different from Catcher in the Rye because we've been talking about Catcher in the Rye. And it's important to read the text. But J.D. Salinger's life, I mean, you know, I get it. I get that, like, he constantly denied rights to make his book into films. And in a way, that sort of echoes Holden Caulfield because he hates movies. He hates the dramatization. He thinks it's fake. He never, because again, that's how his dad sort of is to him and the whole funding of Broadway and all this stuff. And he wants something real and visceral. So it makes sense that he would do that. But I just never liked it. I never liked his pictures. I never liked, you know, any news about Salinger. I just never liked it. I never thought he was cool. I never like really got into him. That's why the last time I read the book was 6th grade. But I am glad that we read this book just now. But thank you for that, Maddie. Really appreciate you. And let's see if we got any other super chats before we hop on over to. Oh, there's one more. Sweet. Awesome. Thank you for that $5. That $5 PayPal from Alan McIntyre. Really appreciate you. Thank you, homeboy, for supporting me. You guys, I want to thank you for being here for this stream. And I won't, you know, I sort of have been doing some deep thinking about and reflection about, you know, what I want to say and share about certain things. But I will say that before I go, that and we got a $5 donation from Alan. So thank you very much, sir. But I will say that thank you for being here for the stream. And there are things in this book, you know, the especially the prep school and the private school things that you know, in my own life, right? Like when he talks about like the navigation of private school, you know, I understand that. But also with him dealing with the death of people that he loves. And I will just say, I'm not sure really what I should say or how to say this, and I'm not trying to bring anybody down at the end of the stream, but I will say that, you know, rest in peace. God rest his soul to one of my friends who just passed away. He was a good friend, and he was a supporter of this channel. He is one of the first supporters of this channel in real life. He shared the stream with a number of people in real life, and he got them to watch. and he was always here watching. You didn't see him, but he was always here watching. He watched, and he was loyal. He was good. He was a good man, and he was one of the real ones. And God rest your soul. I love you out there, buddy. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here with me. And we can now we're gonna hop on over to Andy BPF, the Crucible, and of course to JD, our buddy JD, over at Jay's Analysis, over at Jay's channel. He's also streaming. So thank you to all my homeboys. Thank you to everybody who's here. Thank you to everybody who always supports me. Thank you to all my friends and family. And listen, last thing I'll say before we go: reach out to your friends and family. Keep your friends and family close. Love them. Give all you can to them. I'm not offering advice. I'm just saying, you're here 1 minute and you're gone the next. You never know. So make sure you tell the people that you love them. So I love you all, and thank you for being here. And that's all I got. Peace, y'all. I'll see you. Peace.